One of my friends in the Pakistani American community had shared with me, he's in the IT community, his frustrations with governments in South Asia, across South Asia, India, Pakistan, et cetera. The amount of money that was allocated for education, which I think at the time he was claiming was like 2%. And he was contrasting that with the arms race in terms of nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan, and the fact that the societies, the governments themselves, didn't seem to understand that their long-term interests lie with educating their population and educating women and providing them the ability to, the question is the capacity of governments, I guess, and the willingness of governments around the world to recognize that education for women and girls is important, but also to budget for it. And then there's the separate question, which I wanted to ask our first two panelists, and that is, for those governments putting money into childhood education, how concerned should we be about their capabilities of doing it effectively? So I'll just ask you that question.
Thank you, Chairman. I actually think it's, of course, there's a limited capacity. As you mentioned, if the budget's only 2%, the capacity is obviously going to be a bit limited, and hopefully with international aid and more focus paid on education.
And those were his figures. They're not mine. I don't know what the real figures are.
Unfortunately, I don't have that statistic with me either.
But it is.
If it's close, there
I think his point is probably true.
What I'm actually really concerned about, and I heard some activists from Pakistan here yesterday at the Atlantic Council, was the role that non-government organizations in education plays on these communities. So ones that are funded from overseas, that have alternative motives in funding these schools, and the religious schools, they may be creating a problem that even if the central government is trying to solve and create a very strong secular educational system, we need to be careful about what's going on alongside it by these other institutions that they don't control.
Yeah, I think especially some of the Gulf state money that goes into the Deobandi schools.
Yes.
Or how am I supposed to pronounce that?
Deobandi, yes. You and I have been talking about this for almost 2 decades now. So,
well, I've had 3 trips to Pakistan where I've talked unceasingly about this with the government, and there's 600 schools which they admit are problematic, and those 600 we've never gotten closed. There are tens of thousands of madrasas that educate to some extent young people in a positive way, but there are 600 schools that we know are doing this, and there isn't the political will to confront that faction either in the legislature or out in among the support for the Taliban to get them closed.
And I think the problem, and I've understood this from government officials in many countries, is that it's not just the education that creates the problem. It's the sense that these communities, they provide funding, they provide resources, food, social services to the surrounding community in addition to the kids' education, that it becomes a real difficult social, political problem to close that school. Then all those resources going to that community are cut.
But that's the insight of the Gulf state benefactors, those families who are sending that money, because they know that that's the way then to pull people in and
the Hamas
radicalize them.
Actually, the latest figures for a place like Pakistan are slightly less than 2% is going towards education. So it's actually quite, it's a very bad situation for it. In terms of where is the most effective money, in studies which have been done, they found that the level of moving from primary to secondary education, if you can actually have secondary education, it actually has a direct impact on the risk of conflict in those areas. And there have been places in Africa where they've seen it actually dropped it by almost half. If you can actually reduce the education inequality between men and women. So the need is huge, and it actually would have a huge impact. Now, are the governments doing it? No. Is there political will? Not really, because there's enough other, I hate to say excuses, but there are enough other reasons that they feel that there is other concerns that they would like to focus on instead.
But you feel that electing more women to office in those countries can help drive this agenda of more money for education,
Yes.
because so much of it is going to be allocated to this idea of allowing young women an equal chance at education, right?
Necessary part of it, and I think the other part is also education reform, the curriculum reform itself across all levels. It doesn't matter whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary,
Yeah.
because there is issues around, obviously, some of the problematic madrasas, but at the base level, there needs to be educational and curriculum reform across the system to reduce the general level of the sense of hate-mongering happens in many places.
So anti-Western curriculum, to pick one example, might be a problem that you've seen in some of the textbooks themselves in South Asia?
It's things which are, we need curriculums which promote social cohesion,
Yeah,
rather than actually emphasizing difference and conflict.
yeah.
And so that has to permeate curriculums across the board, not just in madrasas.
One of the things that I've seen that's pretty inspirational is, especially out of the physician community, when you have graduates of, women or men who have doctorates here in the United States, they tend to be tremendously successful in the West, and the amount of time and effort they give back to, their education, to their medical schools, or to setting up schools in Pakistan, for example, that's where I think a lot of the insights can come from, in terms of people who are enormously successful here and yet are having a hard time figuring out how to work with USAID or our government in order to leverage their expertise and their hard-earned dollars that they contribute back in order to try to improve society and in order to try to increase education and so forth. I wonder how we could better get USAID to work with the diaspora or with the community here in the United States in meeting these challenges and maybe leveraging these dollars and so forth.
Actually, it's something I mentioned in my written testimony, that we need more cooperation between our government bodies and the diaspora community. And I know there has been several attempts, and the USAID has a particular office that handled that, but knowing some people that had participated in those conversations, it's often just a very simple discussion. It doesn't get to concrete examples of how to move these initiatives forward. And I know it happened right before this one RFP was coming out, and it ended up a $200 million RFP, and the community responded that there's no way any of us can absorb that kind of an RFP. If you want us to help and you want us to suggest schools, none of us are capable of that level of commitment and that responsibility. So I think the relationship kind of broke apart at that point, but it's important to focus
I'm
back.
trying to set up a dialogue with USAID, and I wondered if you could assist me with that on this subject, where
Of course.
we're going to bring in
I'd be happy to.
representatives of the community. Thank you very much. My time's expired. Mr. Keating.